Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next game is Kid Icarus. For many of you, I imagine Kid Icarus is the franchise you know as that one Sakurai brought back for Smash Bros, then made a one-off revival of on the 3DS. Personally, that's where I first heard about it too, although I did eventually play the original NES game before going into the challenge. This one was designed by Nintendo R&D1, although the actual development of the game seemed pretty rough. This game was primarily the work of Toru Osawa, a relatively new hire who was a graphic artist. It may seem odd to assign an artist as the primary creator for a video game project, but this was pretty common for Nintendo at the time. Both Miyamoto and Sakamoto started off as artists too. Yokoi, the head of R&D1 at the time, believed that if you can make pixel art, you can make a game. Anyway, during the development time for Kid Icarus, Metroid was in rough shape, leading many of the R&D1 members to focus on getting Metroid out the door, leaving Osawa all by himself on Kid Icarus. While the programming was contracted to an external company, as was often the case for Nintendo at the time, all aspects of the design were left to Osawa, although eventually Sakamoto helped out a bunch too. Osawa recalls those days being full of all-nighters, and apparently, they even made makeshift beds out of broken down cardboard boxes at the office. At the time, Osawa was getting married too, and while the game was supposed to finish before the wedding, he ended up having to work on the game much later than expected, and he even worked on it up until 3 days before the game's release date. Osawa had to cancel his honeymoon, and despite asking for 3 days off after the wedding to get settled in, he was urgently called back in on the second day. Yeesh, and I thought the crunch times during my time working in the tech industry were bad. Surprisingly though, Osawa seems to recall this time with some level of fondness, saying that he was still happy during the development of the title and that he felt very motivated and passionate about working on the game. Osawa liked Greek mythology, which inspired the game's setting, and he wanted to make an action game with RPG elements, which inspired the game's health and upgrade systems. Despite the hectic schedule, the game launched on the Famicom Disk System in Japan in December of 1986, only a few months after Metroid, and it would then be ported to the US in July the next year. While it never became a huge franchise like Super Mario or The Legend of Zelda, it still sold an estimated 1.7 million copies. Not bad for Osawa's first time ever designing a video game. Alright, that's the history of the game, so let's see how it turned out. Once again, the story of this one is explained in the manual. There was once a kingdom called Angel Land, where gods and humans lived together in harmony. The kingdom was ruled by two goddesses, Palutena and Medusa. While Palutena loved mankind, Medusa hated them, and she would destroy their crops and turn them to stone. In anger, Palutena cursed Medusa to take on a monstrous form and banished her to the underworld. There, Medusa would join forces with the creatures of the underworld and attack Palutena's home, the Sky Palace. Medusa's forces overwhelmed Palutena's, and Medusa turned Palutena's warriors to stone and imprisoned Palutena herself in the Sky Palace. As a last-ditch effort, Palutena sought the help of a young angel named Pit, who was imprisoned deep in the underworld. Pit is who you play as in this game, and your objective is to climb out of the underworld, find the 3 sacred treasures that have the power to defeat Medusa, and take back the Sky Palace. The game starts you off in the depths of the underworld, and your objective is to climb up. Before getting too much into this, sorry for how oversaturated the gameplay looks. I was messing around with some color settings at the time, and it will look a bit better later on in my session with the game. Anyway, in Kid Icarus, you start with a pretty weak bow that can only shoot a bit in front of you. I pretty quickly ran into some snakes that dropped some hearts. These hearts basically serve as the currency in this game, although these small hearts the snakes dropped weren't worth all that much. I pretty quickly found a door that led to an empty room. Huh? I think this might be some kind of special room that can upgrade your character, but typically these require you to defeat enough enemies beforehand to activate it, so it's kind of weird they put one so close to the start like this. I kept going, and eventually I found a harp, which turned all the enemies into mallets for a brief time. Kind of random, but okay, sure. You can collect these, and they will have more of a use later on. Eventually, I found another secret room, although this one was a trap. You can't escape these kind of rooms until you fight all of the enemies, which are for some reason a bunch of flying noses with eyeballs. Despite being designed as a trap, these rooms are actually pretty useful, since they can help you rack up experience and hearts. Later on, I ran into this Grim Reaper dude who goes crazy once he spots you, summoning a bunch of mini Reapers that fly in and attack you. Behind him was another type of room called the Treasure Room. There are a bunch of mystery pots in here, and all of them contain goodies except for one of them, which contains the God of Poverty. However, if you manage to get every item before opening the pot containing the God of Poverty, you'll get an extra useful item in its place. Now, I've played this before and I already knew about a trick to these rooms. While the God of Poverty is always in a random pot, there's a pretty limited amount of configurations, so it can be pretty easy to figure out which configuration you have and guarantee that you'll get the bonus item. I kind of forgot that you could get the bonus item at first though, and I just ignored the final pot and grabbed all the goodies instead. I continued to make my way through the stage, but my health was starting to get super low. You don't start with a whole lot of health in this game, so these early stages can be kind of rough. Thankfully, I made it through and finished level 1-1. At the end of a stage, the game adds your current score to a total score, and this actually sort of works as experience. Once you reach a high enough score, you'll level up and increase your max health. I didn't get enough here though, so I went into level 2 with only a little bit of health still. To make matters worse, the game doesn't refill your health after a stage, so I started with only a sliver of health remaining and immediately lost my first life. Pit lets out an iconic "I'm finished," and you are set back to the beginning of the stage you died on. Luckily, this happened so early, it barely mattered. After making my way through the stage, I eventually ran into a shop, but I couldn't afford any of the fancy looking items. The item on the left is a bottle of life, which serves as a life refill once you run out of health. The barrel in the middle serves as a permanent upgrade that lets you store more bottles of life than just one, and the feather on the right lets you recover once from a fatal fall. I guess I'll have to wait until later to see these things in action though. Man, this stage ended up being kind of rough. One thing that's really tough about this first world is that since you are constantly scrolling the screen up, falling below the screen scroll makes you instantly lose your life and restart the stage. Brutal. This tricky platforming element, plus how low your max health is at the start, makes the first world really tough. It's kind of an issue I have with this game in general. Once you get enough upgrades, as we'll soon see, the game becomes a lot more manageable, but it's really brutal at first, making it tough to get into. It ends up having sort of a reverse difficulty curve as a result. After losing a bunch of lives to this stage, I had run out of stream time for the day, and since this first run was going so poorly, I decided to start a fresh run on the next day. This time, I decided to grind a bit on the mini Grim Reapers to see if I could get an earlier life upgrade. Oh, and I also did this treasure room properly this time and got a free potion. Sadly, despite getting more points, I still didn't quite reach the first health upgrade. Bummer. In level 1-2, I actually had enough hearts to buy a feather, which I figured was probably worth it at this point in the game. Near the end of the stage, I found a secret chamber. These rooms give you an upgrade if you've defeated enough enemies throughout the stage. Luckily, I had indeed defeated enough enemies, upgrading my arrows to level 2, which basically just makes them stronger. Oh, and it turns my outfit green for some reason. I think some of Pit's ults in Smash Bros are actually based around the different tunic colors that come with these upgrades. Additionally, by the end of the stage, I had enough points for the first health upgrade, which effectively doubled my health. Nice. In stage 1-3, I found another treasure room, and in this one, I got a credit card. This thing lets you buy items you can't afford in shops, but once you do this, you'll have to pay back your debts before you can buy anything else. Kind of a weird item for a Greek mythology setting. After a bunch of enemies and some treacherous platforming, I found a sacred training chamber. Here, you are given a challenge where you need to survive a bunch of these weird tiles thrown at you. If you survive, you get one of 3 special weapons, not to be confused with the 3 sacred treasures. These 3 weapons are fire arrows, which increase the hitbox of your shots, the sacred bow, which extends the range and speed of your arrows, and the protective crystal, which creates a shield around you that damages enemies. I remember really liking the shield, so I grabbed it first. However, something kind of weird about these items is that you have to have enough health for them to activate, with each having their own point where they are active. This unfortunately made it so that I couldn't even use the shield at first. Another aspect of this game that makes the early game even harder. To my dismay, I lost all of my health right at the end of the stage and went back to the start, which also made me lose the special weapon I just earned. Oh, and I think I lost my credit card too. Bummer. I did manage to get the shield power up again though, and this time I was able to actually finish the stage. Thankfully, I also got enough points that I got my second life upgrade already too. Up next was stage 1-4, which shifts to a completely new style of stage. The final level of each world is a big maze, sort of similar to the dungeons in The Legend of Zelda. In these dungeons, you can find a map, although it's useless on its own. To use it, you'll have to find a pencil, which helps you mark which places on the map you visited, and a torch, which tells you your current position. Your main objective in these stages is to find the boss and defeat it. Additionally, in these dungeons, you can find some of Palutena's warriors, the Centurions who have been turned to stone. This is where the mallets come into play, as hitting one of these statues with the mallet will release the Centurion and they'll assist you with fighting the boss. These maze stages are pretty confusing. They've got branching paths, one-way falls, and rooms with walls that mean you can't just brute force your way immediately to the end. Oh, and for some reason, you can't use your super weapons at all in these levels, so no shield for me. The worst thing in these dungeons, though, are the eggplant wizards. These dudes will shoot eggplants into the air, and touching one will turn you into an eggplant. Man, this game has some weird enemies. Anyway, in eggplant form, you can't attack at all, and you have to make your way to a hospital room where a nurse will restore you back to your original form. What are these nurses doing deep in these dungeons anyway? Additionally, there's shops in these stages too, and since they typically had health restoring items, I would grind option for hearts to get my health restored. In this game, there's actually a code you can use to make shops cheaper, although it has a chance of backfiring and making them more expensive. In these dungeon stages though, you can refresh the shops as much as you please, so there was no reason not to use it here. Eventually, after a bunch of wandering, I found the first boss, Twin Bellows. This guy just slowly walks around and occasionally shoots fireballs at you. The Centurions joined me for this fight, but honestly, they were kind of lame. They get defeated in a single touch, and they often just miss the boss anyway. It was a bit close, but I kept mashing shots at him and eventually took him down. First world complete. Defeating him granted me one of the 3 sacred treasures, but you don't actually use these until the end of the game. Thankfully, I got another health upgrade here too though, and it was on to world 2. I finally escaped the underworld, and now I'm in the overworld. At this point, the game has a huge drop in difficulty, as I'm now moving from left to right, so falling isn't nearly as common anymore. Near the start of this level, I found a hot spring, which refilled my life to the max. This finally activated my shields, which was super nice too. Man, these shields are so busted. Here, I bought that barrel I mentioned earlier, meaning I could store more waters of life. I also finally got the credit card back here too. If that wasn't enough, I found another one of those sacred chambers, and I was able to upgrade my attack again, and now my clothes were changed to purple. Wow, this level is full of goodies. I found another training chamber too, and I got my second special weapon, the sacred bow. Although once again, I didn't actually have enough health to use it at first. I ended up beating stage 2-1 with ease, and upgraded my health once again. In 2-2, I found another strength upgrade. Why couldn't they put this many of these things in the first world? However, my lucky streak was coming to an end, as there are these annoying thief enemies that can steal your special weapons in this level. Apparently, they sell them to some of the shop owners, as you have to buy them back when this happens. They stole the sacred bow here, but thankfully I had enough hearts to buy it back soon after. While I did say there wasn't as much of a chance to fall here, there were still some platforming sections with bottomless pits, and I even fell into one, but thankfully I still had one of those feathers at this point. Unfortunately, I didn't have one later on though, when I stupidly jumped to my doom. There's certain kinds of jumps you can perform that when you commit, you can't turn back around, and that's what happened here. On the next run, despite trying harder to avoid the thieves, I somehow got the sacred bow stolen again, just like last time. Ugh, stupid thieves. Thankfully though, I managed to get through the platforming obstacles this time, and I beat the level. 2-3 was a bit more spooky, with dark mountains in the background and some tombstones on the stage. There were a bunch of the thief enemies here too, but thankfully I got past them safely this time. I also found another training chamber, meaning I was finally able to nab the last of the special weapons, although once again, I didn't have nearly enough health to activate it. This stage was honestly pretty easy, and I got through it without losing a single life. Next up was 2-4, another dungeon stage. Well, despite my earlier comment about the game getting easier as you go on, that's not really true for these dungeon levels. These just keep getting more complex and difficult as you go on. After a bunch of wandering and turning into an eggplant again, I finally made it to the boss of World 2, Hewdraw. This boss was a serpent dragon guy that just bounced around the room. He was pretty easy, although the Centurions were kind of worthless again. Man, these guys are so bad. Thankfully, you don't really need them, as Hewdraw went down and I still had over half of my health remaining. Second sacred treasure obtained. The next world was the Sky World, and similar to the first world, this one has me moving vertically again. Oh boy. Thankfully, with all of these upgrades and items under my belt, this still ended up being a lot easier than the first world. Right away, they gave me another hot spring, so I was able to finally check out those fire arrows. It may not look like much, but honestly, these fire arrows make it so much easier to hit enemies than it was with those thin arrows. All of these upgrades combined make you so much more powerful than you are at the start. That's not to say the world was completely free, there were still some tricky platforming sections, but I didn't end up dying once in this world, making it the fastest of the 3 main worlds for me. However, I still wasn't quite done upgrading. I found one final strength upgrade near the end of 3-1, changing my outfit to blue for the final upgrade. In 3-2, something kind of funny happened. I entered another training chamber by mistake, but since I already had all 3 of the special weapons, I immediately left and the dude called me a weakling. Oh, come on. Also, for some reason, one of the enemy types in this level was straight up Metroids. Well, the manual calls them Komatos, but that looks like a Metroid to me. After some more platforming, I made it to 3-3, and I kept climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing. Eventually though, I made it to the end of the stage and it was time for the next dungeon. This one was the toughest one yet. If only they didn't take away your special weapons during these. This one was pretty large and confusing, but the worst part was that there were some nasty eggplant wizards near the end and you had to go so far back to find a hospital. I got hit by these guys multiple times and man, it was so frustrating. I eventually decided to just reload the room over and over until I saw them doing a pattern I knew I could dodge. Finally, after getting past these guys, I made it to the boss, Pandora. Pandora shoots a couple of bubbles and just flies around the room. Like most bosses in this game, it took some time, but ultimately she wasn't all that difficult. I took her down and grabbed the final sacred treasure. After this, I got a cutscene of sorts that told me that Pit had equipped the 3 sacred treasures. Time for the final level, the Palace in the Sky. For this stage, the game basically just changes to a shoot 'em up, and you have to defeat a bunch of enemies to progress. Apparently, the level repeats until you've defeated 100 enemies, although I think when I first played the game, I thought the stage just repeated a couple of times regardless. After you defeat enough enemies, you are taken to the final boss, Medusa herself. Ew, she's just a big monster head attached to a wall. Medusa fires a bunch of beams at you and sends an occasional snake out, but I pretty quickly found a spot that was completely safe. Wow, she has some pretty garbage aim. It didn't take long for her to be defeated, revealing her true form for a moment as she fell to the ground. Now, you actually get a different ending based on how well you did. Basically, this is determined by how many upgrades you received and whether or not you had max hearts. Most of these show Pit with various types of outfits on. However, the best ending, the one I received, turns Pit into a buff guy and Palutena kisses him. Considering Pit does not look like this in later games, I'm going to guess this isn't actually the canon ending. Anyway, with that, Kid Icarus was complete. On to the review. While I do find Kid Icarus fun, the balancing of this one really holds it back. You are just so weak at first, and I don't really feel like the level design matched up with how much you grew in power over time. It kinda makes a bad first impression, but I think it really starts to get better as you power up. The dungeons add an interesting twist, although I kind of wish they let your special weapons carry over to these levels, but oh well. Overall, it's a solid platformer, it just unfortunately has some pretty serious balancing issues. I gave the game a 7 out of 10. With Kid Icarus complete, I have now finished 43 out of the 124 NES games in the challenge, meaning I am now 34% of the way through all of the NES games. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.